And welcome to this deep dive session, Teasing Out the Social Impact Bond, or SIB effect, Emerging Evidence and Practical Insights. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive session at the Social Outcomes Conference. In this panel, we will discuss and assess what's increasingly being referred to as the SIB effect. That is the influence of this very particular contracting and funding model on social outcomes when compared to alternative approaches to funding social programs. Much of the early evaluation work on impact bonds focused on the effect of the intervention rather than the extra efficacy or efficiency, if any, added by the particular SIB contracting strategy. But practitioners and researchers in the world of social outcomes contracting and impact bonds often find themselves asking, what is the SIB effect? Can we measure this? Does it exist? How big is it? So in this discussion, we are framing impact bonds as one approach among several available for funding and holding social programs to account. Where SIBs have been adopted, more conventional grant arrangements, in-house services, or fee for activity contracts could also have been used. What galvanizes a lot of the community at this conference is either a belief in or a curiosity about the influence of the impact bond contracting model on the achievement of social outcomes. So in this session, we'll hear from 4 fantastic panelists on what the SIB effect might look like. I'll ask the panelists to introduce themselves briefly before they give you a short presentation on their work. And we also have 3 great respondents on the line joining us this morning. Christy Economy, James McGowan and James Ronicle will also be waiting in the wings to respond to the presentations and the discussion in the chat. As ever, this conference is characterised by the chat being a pretty lively place. So we're really keen to kick off the discussion there. I wondered whether to get the ball rolling, we could get a flavour of who is in the Zoom room. So please could you take a moment to write in the chat, tell us, have you been involved in delivering or evaluating a social impact bond or development impact bond? Which ones? And throughout, please do keep these comments and questions coming in. What have you detected as the SIB effect? And how does this relate to our speakers' presentations? Okay, so we'll have some more formal presentations to kick us off, and then we'll move into some discussion and we'll feed in the questions from the chat throughout. So to kick us off, I'd like to invite Lucas to take the mic. Lucas is a PhD candidate at the Bern University of Applied Sciences, and he will be presenting a paper that he's co-authored with Deborah Heavenstein and Alec Fraser. The title is The Contractor versus the Contractee Perspective, Creaming or Best Practices. So over to you, Lucas.
Thank you, Al. I will just start sharing my slides. All right, can you see those?
Perfect, thank you.
Great, thanks. So as Al mentioned, I'm a PhD student at the Bern University of Applied Sciences in Switzerland, and this is a paper I'm co-authoring with Deborah Heavenstone, who is leading this project, which is about isolating the SIB effect, which we think should be measured as the added effect of the SIB financing or the SIB contract if you confront this to a program which is confrontable on all dimensions, so similar type of clients and programming, and which is not a SIB, so which would be a grant contract or any other more standard type of contract. And also with my colleague Alec Fraser from King's College London, who already presented on Wednesday afternoon on his paper. So in this paper, Creaming or Best Practices, the research question is, does the introduction of a high incentive contract, so of a SIB contract, induce selection? And if there is a selection, so if we focus on the more work-ready clients, for instance, in an active labor market program, can this be justified because of improved outcomes for these clients? So I'd like to draw on Alex Jensen's metaphor of the stepping stone. Let's assume that the stepping stone for entering into the labor market is really big, and we know that it's only the strongest participants that are going to make it, does it make sense to focus on these? And we think that this question is relevant because we think that this is a reality for many social service providers, that they have multiple funding streams, which they run concurrently, and they need to see how they manage clients, how they manage services on these different contracts. So in this case study, we are looking at a program for labor market integration, which is targeted at refugees. And we have data going back to 2010 to when this particular provider was running a program, only one program, which was not a SIB up to the year 2015. And then in 2015, the SIB was introduced concurrently to the non-SIB. So from 2015 onwards, we have two parallel programs running up to 2020. We have data until 2019. And so the first thing we did was to look at the client pool for the time before 2015. So when there was only the non-SIB, or what I refer to as the pre-SIB. And then for the time after 2015, if we put the SIB and the non-SIB population together. And what we see is that they are roughly similar in terms of their characteristics. They're roughly similar in terms of their language levels. There is people with low skills, people with high skills. There is less people that have not completed compulsory education in the later years. So we see that there has been an overall increase in the education level. And we also see that the share of male participants has risen over time, but otherwise these pools can be called roughly similar over time. What we also see is that there's been an increase overall in the number of clients served, because there has been an increase on the non-SIB itself. And of course, there have been the added clients due to introducing the SIB at the same provider. So in this kind of more or less stable client pool, we are now going to introduce the SIB contract, or rather we are going to have the situation with two parallel contracts. And here I just listed the funding per SIB, the funding per client on the SIB and the non-SIB, and also the work percentage points per client on each program. So in this second box, what we have is the work percentages added for all the job coaches and social workers, and then we divide them over the number of clients per year and see, well, how much time of each job coach do they get on each program. And in the first box, we just have the funding for each client. And these are estimates, and especially the funding for the SIB, the estimate for the SIB funding is actually an overestimate. This is just the contractual volume spread over the 5 years. We're going to have numbers for the actual spending later in our research, but I think it still shows the picture that even if it is an overestimate, we see that there's been more money per SIB client on this program than for the corresponding non-SIB clients in each year. What we also see, however, is that there's been less work percentage per client for the SIBs. So we can assume that the caseworkers had more time to spend with their clients. We also see an evolution over time because there has been an admission stop to the program in later years. So at some given point, there could no longer be any more SIB participants introduced into the program. And we see how then, of course, the money and also the work percentage per client increases dramatically in 2019 when this admission stop was introduced. And I guess we also get an overall flavor of how the SIB can, of course, compensate for the lack of work percentage by having more money. And contrary to the non-SIB, they were also able to finance external services. So they could, for instance, send people to external language courses, which was not possible on the non-SIB. So due to the SIB contract and also contractual changes on the SIB contract, the money on the SIB was much more flexible than on the non-SIB. And I cannot show you the target grid, there would be a lot of info, but just to say that basically how the incentives on the SIB contract were stated if we confronted to the non-SIB contract, then the incentive was to enroll as many mid to high skilled clients into the SIB as possible and keep the weaker clients in the non-SIB. And actually, this was even stipulated like this in the contract. In the contract, there were no targets to be hit for low skilled clients, only for mid to high skilled clients. So there would have been no reason for the provider to introduce low skilled clients or low placeable clients into this program. So what happens, of course, is then a selection where we see that the people with lower completed education in this flowchart or Sankey chart, they've already been introduced yesterday afternoon, that most of the people with lower education levels, they will be going into the non-SIB, and most people with the higher education levels, they will be going into the SIB program. What we also see, what those NAs in the top left box are, is that the data quality on the SIB is a lot better than on the non-SIB. And now if you focus on the green box, the completed education concluded box, then you'll say, okay, it looks like people that have completed compulsory education, they have like a 50-50 chance of going into the SIB or the non-SIB. But actually, of course, factors are interdependent. So on the right-hand side, the blue graphic, we plotted the predicted probabilities from our model for people with certain characteristics to go into the SIB versus the non-SIB. And we see that for somebody who has completed compulsory education, well, if they only have a language level which is A1, they are not likely to go into the SIB. Versus if they have completed compulsory education and they have language level B1 or higher, they are highly likely to enter into the SIB. So I'd like you to think that in the lower arms, there are the people with compulsory education concluded, but also with the higher language skills. We went further to look at the kind of support which the SIB clients got versus the non-SIB clients during the time from 2015 to 2019. And unfortunately, we only have 3 dimensions on which they are comparable because they have received different services outside of these 3 interventions. But what we have is the number of conversations longer than 15 minutes, which they had with their job coaches. And what we see is actually that people on the non-SIB, they had more conversations with their job coaches. This, of course, ties also in with the work percentage points, which are available on each contract. We see that people get more basic PC courses or job search courses in the non-SIB program, but the number of language courses is roughly the same. They are equally likely to attend a language course in each of the programs. And so it's difficult here to draw a clear picture of whether SIB clients were supported more intensively in their program than the non-SIB clients. We do know from interviews that the language courses on the SIB were, for instance, more intense because they had a smaller class size, they were higher cost, they had more external courses, and they happened more frequently during the week. And also it could be that the conversations that job coaches on the SIB had with their clients were much longer. This is something which we cannot measure. But I think what we can draw as a conclusion is that yes, there was selection happening, but it was not like the non-SIB clients were just parked on the side of the road. They continued to be served. And I think we can say that they were even sheltered because there was a separate concurrent program with a separate budget that they continued to be served, which maybe would have not happened if we were to imply a high incentive contract to the overall population. And so, of course, this makes it much more difficult for us going forward to measure the SIB effect, because we realize that our original design to confront the SIB to the non-SIB group will not actually be a valid contrast, because we know the SIB group is much more work ready. So we are now moving forward of ways to how to redesign our strategy to actually get a credible SIB effect and the added effect of the SIB programming onto the overall program effectiveness. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Lucas. That research design is always really, really tricky. So I feel for you on that. And maybe we can get into some of the questions around how do you go about designing research to really try and understand the different performance levels or effectiveness across SIB and non-SIB programs in the discussion. I realise that we have grown in number since we kicked off at the top of the hour. So welcome everyone if you joined us a little after time. We're here in this session talking about the social impact bond effect. Broadly, we're trying to investigate the influence of this particular contracting or funding model on social outcomes when we compare it to other ways, alternative approaches to funding social programs. Lucas has kindly just talked us through some academic research on the Caritas SIB in Bern in Switzerland. So thank you for that, Lucas. Next up, we have more of a practitioner perspective. So Ruben, thank you for joining us today. Over to you, please introduce yourself and talk to us about your model. Ruben, we're struggling to hear you. Are you able to unmute yourself, please? Okay, all seems to be a little bit quiet. I'm not sure whether it's just me. Ruben, I wonder if we could press pause on your presentation and move to... Ah, there you are. Okay, great. Welcome. Hello.
Thank you very much. I had 5 minutes, so I spent 2 minutes on my earplugs, so I have 3 minutes left. But my name is Ruben Kukuk. I'm the co-founder and managing director of Social Finance NL, together with Björn, who's also in this call. And before that, I worked 9 years for ABN AMRO Bank, one of the major Dutch banks, where we introduced the social impact bond to the Netherlands. And I'm involved in 10 different social impact bonds with different municipalities and the national government. What we did is, often we get questions from our clients that they want a social impact bond, and if we can put that together for them. And then we ask them why they want such an instrument. And often you get answers like, we want to be innovative, we want to involve the private sector, or we want to mitigate risk. But if you really ask the question, but why do you think a SIB is more effective? Then often the answer is not clear. So what we did is we talked with our clients and other international and national partners to ask, like, what are the key elements to create a effective partnership which can lead to the best social outcomes. And with the answers we got, we created the result radar, and I will show you on the screen what that exactly is about. I think Tanya will put the sheets on, and if not, I can do that. But so we created the result radar, which gives people the opportunity to see whether their partnerships is made in a results oriented manner. And Tanya, shall I share my screen myself?
Yes, please.
Yes. So we defined 4 requirements and 3 catalysts where you can judge your program on. And first, on the first question is whether there's a clear definition of result. So whether the definition of result is SMART and whether it's based on input, output, or outcome. And then we ask on the result radar, what's the method of measuring the effectiveness? With how much certainty can you claim that the results you show are also really attributed to the project? And then the third question is, when we have the definition and the method to measure the definition, is there also active monitoring and evaluation in place? So do the partners also monitor monitor on a regular basis and evaluate whether the results are met. And our fourth requirement is about adjustment. And I think that's very important. And that's also something we claim with social impact bonds, that it's so flexible, that it's more, that are more flexible contracts, so we can adjust the program and improve the program, and we can move budgets and people so the program is most effective. And besides those four requirements, we also defined 3 catalysts to have an effective result-driven partnership. The first is the depth of the partnership. So we asked several questions in how involved all the partners is, and how the dialogue between the different partners and the trust between the different partners evolves. The second one is selection and contracting. So before the partnership starts, did the outcome payer had a process in place to select the best intervention and the best people to get to the best results? And last but not least, we measure whether the whole process is transparent. So can a third party also see what the results are, and can we understand the underlying data, how we get to those results? So that's the result radar. We wrote we have an online tool where you can judge whether how your project scores on the result radar, and it's not a seal of quality, but it's a tool for reflection and improvement, to have a conversation how you can create a most effective partnership. It's also not, it shouldn't be the aim to score the highest score. You can have a 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5 score. It's also shouldn't be the aim to have the highest score on every measurement, because it can also be a trade-off. For example, the most measurement, if you use a randomized controlled trial, you get probably 5 points on that, but it can be a problem on the side of adjustments, because if you want to be flexible, sometimes it's hard to have a randomized controlled trial, because you have to follow certain procedures in order to do a good randomized control trial. So it's not required to score the highest points on all 7 or all 4 requirements and 3 catalysts. So on the next slide, you see how the radar looks like when we plotted it on different projects. So what we did in our report, we plotted the radar on different projects, and the question is, of course, do we expect higher scores for social impact bonds on the result rating compared to non-social impact bonds? Yeah, we believe that's a really hard question to answer, and a bet. I think social impact bond is not, of course, the silver bullet. A bad designed social impact bond can have even weaker scores on the result radar. But if you design a social impact bond well, you should expect that you have a clear definition of results, that you know how you can measure that result, and also that you have flexible contracts. And that's also what we see in our practice when we compare our programs of social impact bonds with non-social impact bonds. However, I do believe, and I think we also discussed that last year in the conference, that transparency is a big issue if we talk about social impact bonds, especially because private investors always have a higher or lower levels of transparencies than we are used to in the social sector. So I think that's really important to work on in the near future. So that's a summary of our result radar.
Thank you so much, Ruben. It's really interesting to hear from a more practical perspective how impact bonds and the design of impact bonds might be differently related to this results focus. Thank you. Next up, we have Sarah Cook. Thanks for joining us, Sarah. Sarah is the director of the Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership, and this is one of the largest impact bonds in the UK that's live at the moment. Over to you, Sarah.
Check I'm not on mute there. Hi, thank you for having me. Just a little about me before I start with KBOP. I'm the director of KBOP there, but before moving over to that company, I've got 20 years housing experience across homelessness and the justice sector, both delivering frontline services in community, prisons, probation services, but then designing and leading a number of innovative pilots. This includes Shelters Transforming Rehabilitation Pilot, and also the GM Homes Partnership of Sleepers Live with Bridges. That is a service that I was particularly proud of being part of. And as part of that social impact bond, we were able to accommodate over 350 entrenchable sleepers who are now living independently in their own accommodation. Working on all the contracts, the thing that I've learned is when we focus on numbers and not on people, we are hitting the target and missing the point. People have got to shape what we do, and they've got to choose their own support and feel enabled to make their own decisions to reach their ambition. We've got to stop fixing and start opening doors towards their opportunities. Next slide, please. So if we just move on to a little bit of a summary today about how we got to this point. In 2003, the Supporting People contracts were launched, but in 2009, that ring fence was removed. This decimated a lot of the local authority projects with huge budget impacts, and it meant that a lot of the protected smaller frontline services were not able to run independently. In response to this, Fusion came up with one of the first social impact bond pilots for young people in the Kirklees area. It was an incredibly successful pilot working in collaboration with Bridges, and by adapting the service to meet the needs of the young people, they were able to get the engagement that hadn't been achieved before on that level. Following on from this success, Kirklees made the decision to collaborate and to merge all the Supporting People contracts across Kirklees together, meaning that they could bring 9 different expert organisations to work as one single unit with that outcomes-based focus. Next slide, please. This is where the reality came in. If we think about what it means moving from a regular grant-based contract to an outcomes-based contract, it was hard work. We had to change everything. We had to change the way they were operating, the way they thought about what they were doing, the way they engaged with the people we were working with. We wanted to move from a deficit-based delivery model to an asset-based service. It had to go back to the people. It had to go back to what they wanted. We had people that had been sitting on caseloads for up to 2 years and nothing had changed for them. It needed to be about empowerment. It needed to be about personalisation. What does that person want? It had to be about the culture change that underpinned all of that and challenging the practice that some of our partners held. It wasn't that they didn't want to move people forward, it was just the way that things had always worked under Supporting People contracts. We heard things like people won't engage or they can't be helped, and that was one of the fundamental things that we challenged. It's not about somebody not engaging, it's about understanding what that person needs and how we need to adapt what we do to reach that person and to bring them in to achieve what they want to do. With the empowerment and the personalisation, it's letting them lead the support, focusing on their strengths. Don't look at weaknesses, don't look at needs and risks and problems, look at ambition. For example, with our personalisation fund, which is a really unique pot of money we're able to use to support outcomes achievement, we had an individual that felt very uncomfortable in the classroom environment, but really wanted to get his qualification. We were able to purchase a laptop, Wi-Fi for his home, and he could complete his qualification in his own learning environment. We had to challenge the culture and underpin the thought process behind it. We're bringing in psychologically informed environmental training, trauma-informed practice, understanding why somebody is behaving in a particular way, and addressing the deep-rooted cause of that behaviour, rather than just ticking a box, completing a support plan and moving someone to where they're supposed to be. In terms of the efficiencies, this has been one of the biggest challenges, moving 9 different providers with 9 different ways of working, 9 different IT systems onto one central system. This has enabled efficiencies of scale, and it's also enabled us as the lead provider to do quality audits, analysis, making sure that we're reducing the number of times that an individual has to tell their story. Instead of a referral, an assessment, and then another documentation, it's one conversation. At the first point of that person asking for help, we're there and we can understand what that person needs and what we need to do for that. And that can be covering substance misuse, if somebody's accommodation's at risk, if somebody wants to get access to employment, to different training opportunities, it's there and we can build on that from the onset. What we also need to do is to make sure that the collaboration is there together. The co-design for all 9 different organisations and the collaboration of what we wanted to achieve was there from the beginning. It's taken a huge investment building that relationship and building that strength of partnership, because without that, this won't work and this isn't an effective way of operating. They're the experts and they have to lead the design. We use the learning from that to shape the qualitative analysis and subsequently drive the performance behind it. But without that partnership and collaboration, it just wouldn't have happened. Fundamentally underpinning everything is changing the system, not the person. Why should somebody have to adapt what they are and who they are just to get access to a system to enable them to achieve their ambition and live independently? It's up to us to understand how we can shape and craft and personalise that process to meet what they need to achieve. Next slide, please. So around all of this, we've observed the key ingredients, and I suppose this is what we feel the SIB effect is in order for our delivery. It's the flexible delivery, it's the personalised budgets, it's the adaptation of our budgets, meaning that we can adjust as we learn. Our collaborative partnership across the sector and across all the different organisations. We have groups where we come together, where we have skill share. So we have people across each of the different partnerships that support each other and link in with each other. So we have a domestic abuse charity that helps somebody that might be in another one of our homelessness services that has experienced domestic abuse in the past, training that staff member to ensure they can communicate more effectively with the needs of that individual. We have to be flexible, the personalised service focusing on people's lives. We've had to enable our delivery teams to continuously innovate and improve their service. And we as KBOP have challenged all of those providers to make sure they're doing that on an ongoing basis. But at the same time, we're investing in them, we're investing in their training, investing in their resource, and we're there to support them. We go out, we're at their staff meetings, and we give them the confidence to deliver in that different way of working. We have to be collaborative. You can't do this without co-creation, and the paramount with this is the participants using the service. They know what works, they know what doesn't work, and they have to shape what we do and how we do it. And we have to deliver across the community. And we learned this more than ever with the recent COVID situation, where we were able to adapt everything we did to respond to community needs, bringing in a helpline, doing food service, doing medication. We couldn't do that with a rigid fixed contract, but we were able to flex all of that with our outcomes-based focus. And it's got to be more accountable, clearly defined metrics, reporting what they're achieving, what they need to do against it, but at the same time listening and evaluating, making sure that the people at the heart of service are leading it, investing in high quality learning and then sharing that across all of our different partners. And I suppose when considering what it is that's the SIB effect for me, it's that relationship, it's that relational partnership. Without that, it's nothing, and we would not be able to facilitate and make that change as we've done in Kirklees. And I'm really pleased to say it's a really positive change, and we've helped over 500 people so far, and it's been huge in terms of that progression. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. You've really helped us see how that contractual shift makes quite substantial changes, and it's really helpful to have that live example. Thank you. Next up, I'd like to pass over to Franziska. Franziska is a research assistant at the Go Lab, and we've been doing some research also on the Kirklees experience. So over to you to give us a flavour of some of the early research work, Franziska.
Thank you, Elle. So yes, as Al mentioned, I've been working on the evaluation of the Kirklees SIB, which is a multi-year research project which investigates the implication of a social impact bond commissioning model on service delivery compared to a preceding fee-for-service contract. What makes Kirklees such an exciting evaluation opportunity is that all providers delivered a comparable service on a fee-for-service contract for more than 10 years. In our research, we identified 4 main challenges related to the fee-for-service contract. challenge number one was a limited ability for the councils to steer the provider market. There were 19 separate provider contracts which had to be managed by 1.5 council staff. In the SIB, there is a single outcomes contract and the management of the provider relationships are outsourced to a dedicated resource. The second challenge of the fee-for-service contract was a limited practice of performance management by the council. It was up to the providers to assess whether the user achieved the intervention outcome independent living. Also, there was no tracking on the sustainability of the outcome achievement. In the SIB, outcomes are clearly defined, like obtaining accommodation and employment, and measured. The council verifies the achievement of the outcomes, and payment is linked to the sustainment of the outcomes. The third challenge was a limited flexibility in service delivery. So for instance, support was restricted to 1 hour per week per service user. In the SIB, it is expected that providers have significant autonomy in service delivery. The fourth challenge we identified was a limited collaboration across providers. So providers' performance was measured against the user numbers on the service, and therefore providers were keen to recruit users to their own services. In the SIB, it is expected that a shared interest in the outcomes achievement enhances co-working on cases. So whether or not the SIB will meet its promise, we will start to explore in our next research phase, and we are looking forward to share our insights with you at the Social Outcomes Conference 2021, and hopefully then in person. Thank you.
Thanks, Franziska. Great, thank you. So there's lots going on in the chat. There are some questions, particularly for Lucas, around the challenges of what people often refer to as creaming. So you talked about the way in which the SIB service tends to be supporting people with higher educational qualifications and who are maybe closer to the labour market. It would be good if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the SIB and the non-SIB service in your study. Also, I'm particularly interested in the effects. You talked a little bit about the difference in the nature and quality of the service for those on the impact bond service, but how and what are your plans for understanding, is there a difference in the achievement of outcomes across the two groups, particularly now that you know that there are differences in the characteristics of those two groups of people?
Thanks, Elle. I was also just replying to Connor's question regarding creaming in the chat. So maybe let me start off with this. I agree with Connor that suitable eligibility criteria are an important thing to get right in order to curb cream skimming. This also resonates with what Richard Johnson said on Wednesday afternoon, that you have to really target the population you wish to be served in order to get this right. Of course, you could say, well, this contract, both contracts were targeting refugees, so they were already targeted at a weaker group to be able to access the labor market. But it is strange then that within this group, they were actually targeting the high and mid-skilled people instead of making it accessible for all people. Also, if you would wish to scale up this program and apply it to the whole population, you will then be applying it to everybody. So if you test this, then why wouldn't you already test it in this way? Going more into the SIB and the non-SIB services, I think what is a bit striking to me is that there was the possibility to refer people from the non-SIB into the SIB and from the SIB into the non-SIB. So the power to the provider to actually select these people was really, really important. And I guess it would have been much better if this selection did not happen within provider, but if instead he just got sent people to him and was stripped of actually this power to select the people to also curb creaming. I think this was also raised by Alex Jensen already on Wednesday. Then going forward about how to measure the two programs, of course, this is not going to be a clean measure. We're trying to get a good of a SIB effect as we can, but we know that the two programs, they are not exactly the same. There are just those dimensions on which we can actually confront those and on which we are going to confront those. For the rest, we will have to do with the estimates of how much was spent on each program. And given that there was heavy selection going on the SIB and the non-SIB program, our current plan is to actually, instead of confronting the SIB to the non-SIB, we know that previously to the SIB, there was a suitable sample in the non-SIB, which was comparable to the SIB program. So instead, we think of selecting a group of high-skilled people that have been served in the non-SIB previous to the introduction of the SIB and confront those people to the SIB program. This, of course, will introduce the problem that these happen not at the same point in time, and that there can be the impact of the refugee crisis, which I think peaked in 2014, which is going to again impact on the SIB effect measure if you then look at their labor market outcomes or social benefit outcomes. But I think that going about it like this as an initial step is a much fairer comparison to getting to the SIB effect than comparing two people which just not have the same levels of work readiness. I don't know if I replied to the whole question.
No, that's great. Thanks, Lucas. One question coming through the chat from Matilda is around the good characteristics to assess impact bonds. Ruben and Sarah, I wonder if I could come to both of you. What would you expect to see better if the theory holds in an impact bond compared to another way of funding a service? Ruben, you're talking about a results orientation. What would that look like?
Yeah, first of all, Anna, can I react on Lucas before I go into your question?
Please do.
Yeah, so so I don't think it's an issue when there are different participants in the different programs, but you have to look whether the benchmark corrects for that or not. Because you don't want outcome payers to pay for a selection effect, you want them to pay for the effect of the intervention. And if you create a benchmark in such a way that that the investors and the service providers are rewarded to help people with a long distance to the labor market instead of a short distance, then it's not a problem at all. But if you treat them the same, then you have a major issue, because then you're not paying for the intervention, but then you're paying for the selection, and that doesn't make much sense. So these are questions when you design such an impact bond who are put on the table, and that's, I think, the big SIB effect, that a lot of discussions which normally are not held, so normally are now put on the table and have to be discussed. And so if I'm going to the result radar, the first question is the definition of results. And we started in Rotterdam. We made all contracts about the definition of results. You have to go out of benefits, and then we count you as successful. And for example, we came in, we then digged bigger into the data, and then we found out that a couple of participants went out of benefits because they had to go to prison, and then you automatically the data shows that you're not unemployed anymore. Like we didn't need to do that if we didn't design the SIB contract. So that's an example where you can bring rigor into the contract, because you really need to know, you need to dig deeper to decide whether you can pay out or not. So I think getting much clearer definitions, a clearer target group is really something a SIB can bring, and it can really bring rigor into the equation. And the second one, and then I will stop, is the room to adjust. So I think the contracts are different than non-SIB contracts. And what we saw in our practice is that it's easier to open up contracts also now with the COVID crisis, and to see how we can learn from our experience and improve the projects, instead of on a yearly basis tell the funders how amazing everything went to ask funding for the next year. So we believe with a SIB in our practice, we can create a more open dialogue about what we really see and how we can improve the results of the intervention.
Thanks, Ruben. That point around people disappearing potentially from the unemployment rolls because they're in prison, I think is a real gem of an example of some of the themes that were picked up in yesterday's discussion from Sarah Henry around dark data and the importance of what's maybe not captured and what's not available to us to examine. I'd like to bring Sarah in on some of the themes that are also coming in through the chat around creaming and parking and the tensions around who do you support within these programs. And could you talk to that and what you see as the social impact bond effect, Sarah?
Yeah, no problem. I think for me, the measurement around performance in terms of numbers isn't always positive. And what's more important for me is the measurement around learning, using that qualitative analysis to learn from what we're doing, to do the adaptation. In agreement with Ruben, changing it. If something isn't working for the people we're working with, we need to do it differently. We need to adapt it and we need to look at how we can make that work. And I think that links in really importantly with collaboration across other services. A SIB in isolation doesn't work. A SIB has to link in with, so a homelessness SIB has to link in with health services, it has to link in with prison, it has to link in with probation, with the Department of Work and Pensions. You can't monitor and manage that independently on its own. It has to be that cross-organisational collaboration and partnership working. I think to pick up on the point about creaming, I would challenge that, and I would say in particular with KBOP, we fight against that, and that's everything that we've done in terms of that centralisation and that quality management to make sure that that doesn't happen. So initially services may be set up that you've got particular outcomes for particular needs where someone might be low or high or medium. And one of the first things that we did is getting rid of that. People shouldn't be put in boxes. You are you. Your needs are relative to who you are as a person. Just because you are low need doesn't mean that you can't achieve something that somebody else can. And in the same way, just because someone's been deemed complex need, or if they haven't engaged with services, that doesn't mean that they can't achieve what they want to achieve. So I think as a way of managing that, I think SIBs can actually complement that, and it can mean that we can actually facilitate and challenge the creaming process. And in particular, what we did at KBOP is remove the independent referrals to the organisation, and we facilitate that. So we make sure that there isn't any cherry picking, we make sure there isn't any creaming, and that anybody that asks for support for our service gets it, they get what they need. And that's where the pushback and the accountability with providers comes in. As my point before, if somebody won't engage, it's, well, what have you done? How have you changed your service? How have you adapted what you're doing to find a way to engage with that person? Is it something linked with childhood trauma? Is it that they can't come into your service? Is it that they're uncomfortable with what you're offering? It's up to the delivery providers to adapt what they're doing to meet the needs of that individual.
Thanks, Sarah. I wonder, Christy, you've done lots of detailed qualitative work on different impact bond projects. Do you have some comments for us around what are we talking about when we're looking at the SIB effect? Is it effectiveness, efficiency, wider systems change? What's your take?
Yeah, so I would say there's just so much nuance when we're trying to think about the SIB effect. And often what we hear about, so one of like the key components of the SIB effect is this point about this more active management of the contract, because you have more resources. So like as Sarah was saying, there's a lot more sort of on the go learning and adaptations and hopefully sort of flexibility that's built into the contract. And I think that's commonly cited as like one of the main pros, the big SIB effect. I think it's probably also important, and maybe could bring into the discussion sort of the flip side of that, which is this point about sort of disproportionality or opportunity costs, because oftentimes government heads or provider leads might sort of express some frustration about all this sort of money and time they're spending on what can sometimes be sort of like a narrow piece of the pie compared to, you know, the wide range of people that they're serving or problems that they're dealing with. So I would say that's definitely a big component. Sort of related to that, I think, is this question about are these like new practices of flexibility and collaboration and accountability sort of sustained? Does the SIB actually sort of build capacity in providers and government organizations? And if it doesn't, can we really call that sort of the SIB effect? I mean, like, it's one thing that maybe you have more collaboration or more accountability on one project, but I think probably more attention might need to be paid to whether or not those sorts of different ways of working and learning are sort of sustained, you know, throughout sort of future programs. And then finally, sort of just to touch on the point about the SIB impacting sort of the referral pipeline, and we talked a bit about creaming and sort of like maybe these incentives to game the contract by serving clients who might be like more outcome ready. There's a different component to sort of the referral pipeline that I think probably also needs attention, and is that sometimes these SIB projects have these pretty big sort of enrollment or referral targets. And that might not necessarily be the case if there's like explicit gaming where we're selecting people who are closer to reaching the outcome, but maybe we're sort of pushing people through to the SIB program to meet those enrollment numbers. And this sort of touches on Sarah's point about making sure that folks who are enrolled in services have a voice and are able, so making sure that they're not, and this is sort of particularly for children's services when there might be a whole sort of array of different services that you could provide, and making sure that like the default isn't the SIB just because we need to meet those numbers. So there's so many different possible effects of the SIB and so much nuance.
Thanks, Christy.
Yeah.
James Ronicle, I wonder if I could bring you in here as well. A lot of your research work is beginning to touch on these themes. There's also a comment in the chat from my colleague Claire around the potential spillovers. And Christy, you were beginning to get at this, potentially positive, potentially negative spillovers of impact bond projects for the wider system. James, over to you.
Okay, there's probably three things I want to say, if that's all right. The first one's going to be provocative. And the other two less so. I mean, I feel like I almost spend my life now trying to look at the SIB effect in various different guises. And I feel like there is often so I think there's two things to think about. One is when we say the SIB is different to what? What are we talking about? So I think there's a tendency to just say, oh, the SIB is this and the SIB is this, compared to what? Are we talking about compared to a grant? Are we talking about compared to a fee for service, or are we talking about compared to a payment by results contract? Because I think depending on what you're talking about changes what the SIB effect is. And one of the ones I'd like to challenge quite a bit that I've heard quite a bit in this session is the idea that a SIB is more flexible, and particularly more flexible than a grant. And particularly in some of our projects where we do comparisons, where we look at what's going on in the SIB and what's going on in a similar service that's funded for a grant, I would say grants are almost 9 times out of 10 more flexible than a SIB. You can respond and adapt in a grant way more than you can in a SIB. So I'm not always convinced that this idea that a SIB is more flexible is necessarily there. And one thing we've been looking at this year is how have SIBs responded to COVID, and how have SIBs responded to COVID versus grants. Most grant projects were able to flip and change what they were doing almost immediately. Some of the impact bonds we've seen have described an impasse, because you've got massive contractual obligations. You've got very specific outcomes that you have to achieve. And the world changes overnight, and you can't change overnight because you're tied into massive contracts. So there is some subtlety, and there's a difference between, I would say, straight up flexibility and being able to do data-driven adaptive management. I do think a SIB allows that, but to just say a SIB is more flexible than a grant, I don't necessarily agree with. The other thing I wanted to do, if I can share, as I said, we have been trying to look at the SIB effect for years, and we try and increasingly articulate what is the SIB effect and what would you expect to see. And I'm not going to take credit for this. This is my colleague Kay, who has done this, and I'm hoping you can see this now. Can you see a diagram? This is, in my opinion, again, I'm not taking credit for this, I'm giving this to Kay, the closest I feel that we've got to showing what we think the SIB effect is and what you should expect to see within a SIB. It's fairly complicated, but I think the green boxes are the things that we tend to see and you would expect to see in an impact bond. And the blue, the kind of orange on the left is what actually is an impact bond and how is it different to a normal contract. The blue is kind of what are the consequences of doing that, and then the green is, and the red, what do you then see? So really what we think you see is you've kind of got increased reputational risk, a high stakes environment, clearer focus on outcomes. What this seems to drive is these green boxes here, a stronger focus on outcomes, greater accountability, stronger performance management, adaptive management and course correction, and greater collaboration. You also can see perverse incentives, tunnel vision, and lower staff morale. But to us, this is what we feel the closest we've got to being able to articulate what the SIB effect is. I'll hopefully stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you.
If I can work out how to do that. Okay.
Lots of requests coming in for you to be able to share that slide. So I wonder if we might be able to add it to the deck, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, I've been a bit cheeky because that's not published yet. So I'm hoping no one from DFID is on this call, because if so, I may be in trouble. But give me a month and I'm hoping that'll be published.
Okay, well, you'll have lots of eager readers when it does come out, James. Okay, some of the questions and themes coming through in the chat are around flexibility, this focus on outcomes, data-driven adaptive management. But I was struck by what you were saying there, James, in terms of impact bonds compared to what? So does this really need to have, you know, we hear a lot about all of the complexity of the contracting, all of the headache of making these things impact bonds. Do we really need all, you know, this big shebang? Can't we just do adaptive performance management without the headache? I'm interested in your thoughts on that, Sarah.
Sorry, could you just repeat that? I was in the middle of responding to someone on the chat then.
I'm interested in your take as to whether these things really need to be impact bonds. Are there other ways in which you could achieve what you're trying to do in your management shifts without all of the complexity of a full impact bond model wrapping around it?
Yeah, I think, so as per my last slide, really, I think we really value the ingredients that go into what making it a success. So I think impact bonds enable the flexibility, they enable the innovation, they enable us to respond to the person. But you could do that with any contract. I think because the key thing from my perspective is that collaboration, is that partnership, is that innovation and forward thinking. You could do that within a government contract. You could do that within a block-based contract. It's just that I feel that the SIB process enables that and enables you to move more quickly and to more flexibly and respond on a different basis. If you don't have that rigid specification, you are able to change what you're doing in line with what you're learning. You are able to adapt. So I suppose it's a bit of both, really. I do think that what is there in terms of that flexibility is a core ingredient for me, but that's not saying that it couldn't work and adapt on other services and other contract approaches.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Francisco, I know that you've done a lot of primary research with the council team in Kirklees. Do you have any comments on whether this needed to be an impact bond? Are there other ways of getting at this flexibility and the benefits of the new outcomes contract?
Yes, thank you, Elle. Yeah, just touching on what Sarah said before, I guess it's very much a question in terms of the effective contract management practice and steering the provider market. It's a question of an adequate resourcing, because as I mentioned before in my presentation, how are you able to manage 19 provider contracts effectively with 1.5 staff and without a central intelligence system, which was denied by the council's finance department for cost reasons. So this is difficult, I guess. And likewise, nurturing a more collaborative environment between providers is in part, at least, a question of council capacity and leadership, bringing stakeholders together and setting up collaborative infrastructure. I guess A different question is about the contractual incentive structure. I think there is a case for linking payment to outcome achievement over time, but as mentioned before by Lucas, the issue of creaming and cherry picking of providers is to be considered, and also how outcomes are defined. One needs to be very cautious about that. So are these actually outcomes or just outputs? Because we have seen outcomes defined as just achieving, well, as just doing a well-being assessment or engagement with the service.
Okay, thank you, Franziska. James McGowan, I wonder if I could turn to you. There's an interesting point that's been posed by Anne-Marie Carey on tough love partnership working. I wonder if you could pick up on that, the experience of impact bonds, and again, where your thinking is going in terms of whether we need the full paraphernalia of an impact bond arrangement on these projects.
Sure. Interesting conversation, actually, really real food for thought for somebody who's wrestling with this stuff from a government perspective. I don't know about the tough love, and I don't know if that's quite the way we would look at it in government, but look, I think what's coming out for me in these conversations is that there are various different things that different people want from contracts, from grants, from public service delivery. There are a range of different stakeholders involved. You have politicians, officials, local commissioners, providers, well-meaning people from a range of different backgrounds, including the private sector and the investments organizations that are involved in these things. And I suppose what we're all really trying to do here is find a way forward that combines a range of different factors, which those different stakeholder groups, notably the people who are driving public services and the recipients of public services, and when I say driving, I mean both the policy forming side and the actual providing side, but also the beneficiaries. You're trying to find something that suits a range of different expectations. Ultimately, everybody wants the outcomes or good quality outcomes for people who are the beneficiaries of services. And I think it was really interesting that the conversation steered towards the idea of involving that beneficiary's voice. I think it was Sarah's talking about KBOP and making sure that these were more person-centered and asset-based approaches to developing these services. And so I think it's, you start to abstractly pull apart what the different parts are of a social impact bond and say, well, actually, there are different elements to this that can be, that if you comprise them all together, we think we're sort of hitting upon a composition of things in the way that SIBs are being constructed that give a lot of those different stakeholder groups satisfaction that they're achieving the things that need to be achieved in order to help those beneficiaries. And so the point around, for example, flexibility in grant making, and James's point, which I think is a valid one, in that there are grants out there that can be very flexible, but do you get the accountability? And that's really important for my stakeholders. And I think about people that I work with in government and the people who are in charge of the use of public money, but also for politicians, for whom it's really important that the policies that they are endorsing and the policies that they have civil servants like me working on are actually making a difference in people's lives, and that public money is being spent in a way which they can then give with some degree of assurity is making a difference in people's lives. And so I think if you try to pull together those different things and comprise them in a package, what we've been trying to do with SIBs and the SIB effect, if you like, is to try and bring together a range of different components that can deliver a set of objectives that ultimately lead to that point where an individual is helped or a set of individuals are helped. I mean, there's a range of different things that have been talked about, which have been talked about for quite a while now. And I do feel that we've kind of got much better down the road of sharpening our nib, if you like, in certain areas. But it's also meant that we've gone into kind of, into bunkers and trying out different things and found actually coming out of that bunker, there were some things that worked and some things that didn't. And sometimes the things that didn't work because they just weren't right for that particular context. And in fact, we've learned how to reapply those things in future policy making and future service design. So, I mean, I kind of, my eyes roll slightly, and this hasn't come up in this conversation, fortunately, when people say, do SIBs work or not? Because I just think, oh, come on. I mean, it's not a simpler question as that. It's a case, the question is, you've got all these component parts and all of these things that are important to people that we think will help improve the outcomes for beneficiaries. And what we're trying to do is see if we mix some of these ingredients together, are we going to get better results for people who really need help and really make an impact on their lives? Because that's ultimately what everybody's trying to do. I was very struck by actually Sarah's point around the idea of outcomes, really focusing people, the different providers that they're working with in Kirklees, on the same thing and building that collaboration and that focus of effort in the same direction. And whilst I accept that it's not always possible to define a service by outcomes, I think outcomes work really well. Obviously, I would for dealing with a range of different policy interventions. And sometimes it isn't always appropriate to use outcomes as the measure. But if you can, and I think there are plenty of places at the moment in public service delivery where they're not being used where they could be, but some that we've really got good at using, I mean, obviously homelessness and housing is one where it does seem to work very well, then trying to get people to coalesce around that is massively important. And so going back to, and I'll sort of shut up after this, but going back to the original presentation, I suppose the thing that really struck me about that, and what I wanted to go back to Lucas, in fact, what I might just do is look up online afterwards more about the Caritas SIB, because I admit I don't know a huge amount about it, is what was the initial intent? Because it was interesting that you've got this group of people who were going into the SIB who had higher skills and higher education outcomes, but what was the intent behind using the SIB? If the contract was designed in such a way that allowed that to be the case, then really, if you're a provider and you're said, and your contract tells you that you should be working with people in slightly higher skill groups, then that's what you'll deliver. That's what you're going to deliver. So I think, sorry, this is a jumbled response to some of the things that are going, but there's so many interesting parts of this conversation. But I think for me, there's some key things that are coming out of the discussion. First of all, design, and why are we designing these things in a particular way, and what are those design features coming together achieving? There's another point that I think is really important around data, and I'll finish here, because it seems to me that this discussion around comparing SIBs with other things, and I take that point as James's point around, well, what are we comparing them to? I agree with that, and I also think, how are we comparing them? Because actually, data is so difficult to come by in public services. I mean, I have constantly conversations with people about data and SIBs, and some people say, well, I thought you should be more data, and some people say, well, there's lots of data, but how you're using it. One of the really tricky things for us as policymakers, and for, I should imagine, evaluators too, is finding data in other parts of public service delivery. Because basically you find that there just isn't good quality enough data, and you aren't able to therefore compare and contrast. And I'm hoping that in the work that we're doing, we're actually creating better data and creating better opportunities for people to compare and contrast things. We're going to give me some data a moment with regards to the work that he's doing today, but that's my take on things.
Thanks, James. I think it's really helpful actually to take a moment to think about the subtlety of the conversation that we're having here. No one's bluntly asking, do impact bonds work or not? And we're beginning to think about them as a really diverse and different set of approaches, each project being quite different in terms of what it's aiming to achieve. I think in the past, we've sort of thought about these things potentially as just an efficiency driving tool. You pay for outcomes and you get a very efficient delivery against those outcomes. Actually, people seem to be talking about these things as potential change management tools, or a way of bringing parties together in a different way, getting different bits of government to work quite differently together. So I think that's really helpful to take a moment to reflect on that. Thank you. One of the other themes that's coming through is this question of accountability. The accountability that you see in outcomes contracts being just of a different order to grants or other ways of funding services. And I wonder if I could bring this data and accountability question back over to you, Lucas. I was struck by the way that there was a big data gap in your Sankey plots, and I wonder whether you could talk a little bit about the different accountabilities that bring to bear on the non-impact bond versus the impact bond situations in the site that you're studying?
So the feeling which I get from our case studies is that one thing which SIBs do is to attract more money. And another thing which they do is they generate better data than the comparable non-SIB services. The issue then is that although there is better data, it is not necessarily available. And unless this data becomes available, you're not actually able to evaluate whatever the SIB effect is. So I think because these contracts are highly complex, involve multiple negotiating partners, if you want to actually access the data on a SIB contract, there's any one of the actors on the SIB contract itself which can try to block you for whatever reason, maybe because they want it to be a success or whatever it may be. Any of them can pull in to say you can't have the data, and that makes it, I think, although there is better quality data, it makes it more difficult to actually evaluate SIBs than more standard contracts because there are more contracting partners to them. Yeah, I guess that's my point to this.
That's helpful. Thanks, Lucas. Ruben, I wonder if I could bring you in to comment on these questions around accountability and the availability of data in impact bonds.
Yes. Yeah, on accountability, I understand there's a promise that with SIBs, all parties are more accountable. Unfortunately, personally, I don't see that in practice. And that's the most important reason is that theoretically, a outcome payer, for example, a alderman or another government official, should be very critical to assess the results and the data leading to those results. But what we see at the end of the contract period, that also the outcome payer, especially when they are politicians, they also want to show how successful the program was. Although they have to pay out then, and then maybe they pay out and the results are not that, but they also want to show that the social impact bond was successful. So in accountability, we don't see that there's a more rigor accountability at the end of the program, unfortunately, because a lot of outcome payers have the same goal as the investors and the service providers, and that's to show how successful their program was. So there I see a major problem with respect to social impact bonds. And I also want to react on James, is that okay with you, on the flexibility? Because I think it's a good point. You need to know what you compare with a SIB in order to say something about flexibility. What we see in the Netherlands is that private grants are pretty flexible, but government grants, subsidies, are really focused on inputs, and it's really hard to negotiate with governments when you want to change the inputs in the Netherlands. And what we see with social impact bonds, that with the conversation with government is a bit more easy, and also what my colleague Björn pointed out in the chat, that the power balance is different, because normally it's really hard as a small social entrepreneur or a small foundation to negotiate with a municipality or a ministry. And if you have investors on your side, it's often the power balance is often different, and you often have a conversation with each other on an equal level.
Thanks, Ruben. Thank you. I wonder if in the final portion of our discussion, we might be able to turn to look to the future. What more do we hope to learn or investigate on the SIB effect? It'd be great to hear from the panel on what they think the questions are that this community should still be asking of the impact bond model. What's still unanswered? And Sarah, I wonder if I could come to you to help us look to the future.
Yeah, that's fine. In terms of the future, I suppose it's moving, for me, it's moving the focus away from solely around the data, solely around the numbers, to what have SIBs achieved? What have we done to challenge the system? What have we done to break down the barriers that happen between the individual funding streams? How has working in this way achieved more for the individuals we're working with, and change the impact that different services have and change their processes? The data is important, and it is there, and it is a key part of what we do, but it's how we use that information to shape the future. So again, for me, another personal example in terms of accessing services, we're using the data where we are struggling to get access to mental health services to go and link in with commissioners, to go and give examples of pilots and how, if SIBs were able to fund specific services, we can evidence the impact that's having on the people we're working with, and then use that evidence to go to the commissioners to look at how they should be funding and commissioning future services, and how they should be changing what they're commissioning in line with our learning from what we're delivering with the SIBs. I very much believe that the SIBs can give that qualitative evidence behind the numbers. So you are achieving the outcomes, that's right, and that is really key and that is really important. But it's what does that mean for the people that we're working with, and what does that mean for the services, and how other services in the community, how they should be working. And it's the wider systems challenge that I think we should be looking towards as future ambition.
Thanks, Sarah. Something very aspirational in that. Lucas, it would be good to hear about your future research plans. What's still unanswered, and what research design or project characteristics would need to be in place to support an investigation to answer these questions?
So I think one thing which has come up during the conference so far is that SIBs seem to be also gameable contracts, and that there is a risk that when you renegotiate the contracts, because you want to have this flexibility on the contracts, that you need to somehow protect those from then becoming corrupted or not reflecting the original targets you wanted to hit. And I guess, I mean, in my mind, when you boil down a SIB to what it is in difference with other contracts, and it is a monitored pay for results contract, which involves also an investor, because most of the aspects of a SIB otherwise you could also have outside of a SIB. And so I wonder if we take different settings for which do allow or which do not allow creaming, and which do allow renegotiation or do not allow renegotiation of contracts, how does having the investor in there, how does it impact on the whole dynamic? How do these relations which I have on the SIB versus the other contracts change in different settings?
Thanks, Lucas. James McGowan, I saw that you were happy to pick up on some of the points that Ruben raised around data availability in the future, and that also links to some of Lucas's comments. Could you come in on that?
Sure. Well, I mean, the point on what Ruben was saying, sorry, I was slightly distracted then, various things coming into my inbox. I think the point around data availability, and Ruben makes people in contracts who want to prove that their program is working, and obviously that has the potential to create bias, I suppose. But equally, if you design a program well and build in features that allow you to have transparency with regards to the data that you're receiving as part of the money that you're providing, then you can, to some extent, circumvent any biases that may emerge. And I hope that they don't, but I've been a provider in the past, I've been a commissioner, and I'm central government, and obviously I can see that there are different incentives for different things. But I mean, for example, in the Life Chances Fund, the £80 million top-up fund that we run for my team at the moment, we have a very clear, I suppose, clauses in our funding agreements to people that the data that is created through the fund will be shared publicly, and the information therefore is information that we as providers of money into the fund want to be party to and have as much data and information as possible. And the basis for that is because we want to share it with people and make it available to individuals across the sector that we work in, to make sure that they can make well-informed decisions in future on their own programs. So I think it comes back to a point around design and thinking carefully when you're setting up your program. How do you ensure that you put in safeguards against the inability to get data out of your program at later stages?
Thanks, James. Thank you. Francisca, I wonder if I could come to you. There are a few comments in the chat that you might like to pick up on, but it would be great to get a sense from you as to what more you think we need to consider as we look into the SIB effect in our research.
Yeah, so I think there are three broad questions are coming to my mind. One is which Lucas and Sarah touched upon, looking at through which mechanisms SIBs operate and what are the implications for service delivery. So addressing questions such as whether enhanced flexibility leads to more innovation at the front line or creates greater opportunities for co-creation. There's another question around the impact of the SIB commissioning model on targeted intervention outcomes. So this requires a robust counterfactual with a comparator model which features the same type of service to the same type of users. And the third question would be around investigating through a value for money analysis whether the benefits of SIB approach outweigh the costs.
Ah, yes, the big treasury question. Thanks, Francisca. Ruben, could you give us a sense of what you see as important in terms of what we continue to learn and think about in terms of the effect or the effectiveness of impact bonds and their use more broadly?
Yes, actually, I think there are not that many studies when a social impact bond is compared with a non-social impact bond contract. So I really applaud Lucas together with Alec and Deborah for all their effort. And I know how hard it is to get all the data on the table and do such research. So I really hope we can scale up that research and can really do that on a global level and compare that many projects that you really have can say something about the methodology. And I think what GoLab is really doing well in the UK and all around the world, but with most countries in continental Europe is not the case yet. It's that it's going out of an ideological discussion, out of politics. And here in continental Europe, it's often still quite a political issue. And I see the COVID crisis as a huge opportunity to not talk about small or big government or to privatize interventions or to do it or to non-privatize it, but to have a very clear discussion as we have here about the effectiveness of interventions and effectiveness of social services. So I see a huge opportunity to get this out of the political sphere and have more in-depth discussion, not about if we should use SIBs or not, but which characteristics of project we really need to get into place in order to get the best social outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, Ruben. I think it's really helpful to restate that impact bonds are no one thing, and we need to begin to think about the relative contributions of different parts of their design, different contributions from the partners and the way that they're brought together. Thanks. James, a lot of your future research is going to be bound up in this stuff. Do you have some comments on what more we need to focus on?
Yeah, I was just thinking that there's probably quite a few people on this chat quite frustrated thinking, come on researchers, you've had 10 years, there are 180 impact bonds and you're still spending 90 minutes debating what the SIB effect is and you can't actually even answer the question, like what's wrong with you? But the reality is, it's one of the, pulling out what the SIB effect is one of the hardest things I've ever done as a researcher. And I've been trying to do it for about 5 years. And it's really, really hard for 3 reasons. Building on a lot of what James McGowan said. One, the data's just not there in terms of what else has happened elsewhere. I'm also very jealous of Lucas because some of the data he's got is excellent, but The measurement of outcomes, just often always isn't there. You don't have the cost data. So it's really hard for that reason. The second one is, I think they are also the most divisive thing I have ever evaluated. And you've either got one set of people who absolutely love them and then will, in my opinion, overclaim what the SIB effect is. And any benefit they've seen in a project will say it's because of the SIB, even though it probably isn't. And then you have another set of people who absolutely detest them and will refuse to acknowledge that the SIB has achieved anything. And lo and behold, a contracting mechanism achieved more outcomes. No, it's about the service delivery. And you have both of those sets of people disagreeing with each other all the time. But the third reason why I think it's so hard, and this is my plea for further research, is no one has yet designed the perfect SIB experiment program where you have the same interventions measured in the same way, launched at the same time, some through a SIB, some through PBR, some through fee for service, some through grants. And that's what you need to do. You need to do that. And then you need to let us collect loads of data, let us pour ourselves all over it. And once someone does that, then hopefully we can not spend 90 minutes debating it and not come up with an answer, but actually be able to provide the answer.
Thanks, James. It often feels like a total cop-out as an academic to say, more research required. Yeah, I just shoring up my job for the next few years. But I think we can see that there are real challenges, but a real excitement and enthusiasm around answering these questions. What the SIB effect is, I think, is still a very live discussion. And indeed, the impact bond model itself is a very flexible, fluid and shifting thing. So there's likely to be no one SIB effect in any case. So we're kind of questing after something that's certainly very elusive and very shape-shifting. I'd really like to say thank you to all of our speakers. Our panelists have been fantastic. So thank you for joining us. Some of you are on very odd time zones. So Christy, thank you in particular for joining us. I know it's a crazy time of day for you. Thank you to all of our audience members. The chat has been a real source of energy and dynamism for the discussion. So thanks for joining us there. It just remains for me to signpost you to the next session, which kicks off at 1 p.m. BST. This is a big picture session on pricing value. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone.